Hello and welcome to my latest video on international relations theory. So first of all, apologies for not having uploaded any videos for quite a while, for several months actually. And the reason for this once again has been work. Work has been very intense this past semester, teaching related stuff, exams, dissertation, supervision, research related stuff. It's really been a very intensive semester this time around, so I just haven't had any time available to record videos. But thanks to those of you who have subscribed for sticking with the channel, even in the absence of any new stuff for quite a long time. Hopefully now over summer I should be able to get some more stuff recorded. Teaching has now finished for the summer, although there is still other stuff going on, but I'm not under as much pressure now as I have been for the past 3 or 4 months. So I'm planning over the summer to start recording and uploading some more videos. So starting here really with a fairly brief video on critical theory. So this is kind of following on from the last theory video. So in the last theory video that I uploaded, we were talking about dependency and world systems theory. So in other words, as I said in that video, those theories are kind of derived from what I might call the Neo-Marxist intellectual tradition. And to kind of round that out, for the sake of completeness, I wanted to talk also about critical theory, which is another branch of what we might call the Neo-Marxist tradition in international relations, but a somewhat different perspective. So kind of going back to classical Marxism. So we kind of mentioned classical Marxism previously. Classical Marxism obviously started with Karl Marx and also Friedrich Engels. And classical Marxism kind of focused mainly on the material world. Marxism is kind of described as being based on historical materialism. In other words, classical Marxists are particularly interested in what we might call the material base of society. In other words, production and the way that society is organised around production. The class system and the class struggle, which is based on the relationship of the different classes in society to the means of production, so what we call the mode of production, the organisation of society around production. So the focus is on material, the material base of society, and everything else is what is called superstructure, so things like the institutions of the state, things like culture, things like family, things like intellectual values, education, the media, art, things like religion. All of this stuff is what classical Marxists see as superstructure, built upon the base, but ultimately not being the fundamental basis of society, the material base being the underlying basis of society. And that kind of materialistic view of society and of the class struggle, and of history ultimately, that kind of materialistic view kind of underpins the whole kind of branch of the neo-Marxist tradition, which developed further, of course, with Lenin. We talked in the previous theory video, we talked about Lenin and his work Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. We talked about how these same ideas kind of developed in the mid-20th century into dependency theory, and ultimately gave rise in the later part of the 20th century to world systems theory. But this whole branch of the neo-Marxist tradition kind of based on this materialist view of the world. So classical Marxism was, again, largely based on this material view of things. But nonetheless, there was also an aspect of classical Marxism which kind of recognised the role of ideas as well. So Marx kind of recognised that the proletariat, or most of them anyway, are not necessarily aware, not necessarily conscious of the reality of their own exploitation. They don't have this class consciousness. And indeed, they are kind of distracted away from realization of their own exploitation by various forms of what Marx called false consciousness. So false consciousness are kind of alternative identities which kind of act as distractions, alternative loyalties, alternative identities, which kind of distract the proletariat from developing this class consciousness, this working class identity. So that includes things like nationalism, for example, national identity, patriotism, all of that. Also things like, you know, religion and many other kinds of different forms of identities. These kind of created what Marx called a false consciousness, which kind of acted as a distraction away from, you know, the development of class consciousness. Now Marx believed that ultimately, you know, this would resolve itself because the misery of the workers would become so great that eventually they would not be, or they would kind of be forced to confront the reality of their own exploitation. Class consciousness would kind of emerge out of that, because of the contradictions of capitalism, because capitalism, you know, would eventually lead to this crisis. Class consciousness would ultimately emerge, and the proletariat would become aware of their kind of class identity and the reality of their exploitation. They would overthrow the system and usher in the new era. But Marx saw this as something that would, you know, again, just kind of happen naturally. And again, something that was inevitable. Again, Marxism is a deterministic theory of history, and it sees this outcome as inevitable. But there was kind of whole Marxist intellectual tradition which evolved after Marx and in the 20th century, which kind of put much more emphasis on the role of ideas and much more emphasis on the idea of a hegemonic capitalist culture, which kind of interfered with the development of a class consciousness among the proletariat, and which would act as an impediment to revolution, impediment to change, an impediment to emancipation. So we find this approach in the work of people like Antonio Gramsci, who I'm going to talk about in a moment, but also in the critical theory school, the work of people like Max Horkheimer, the Frankfurt School, which kind of developed in the 1930s, but kind of continued into kind of the post-war period, and later on developed, particularly in the context of IR theory, by, in particular, Robert Cox. So I'll kind of come on to talking about those people. But the general point here on this slide is to kind of emphasise that there is this whole branch of the Marxist tradition which particularly emphasises the role of ideas and the role of culture in perpetuating and sustaining the capitalist world system. So, I briefly mentioned Antonio Gramsci. So Gramsci was not a critical theorist per se, but nonetheless the ideas that he developed were very much in the same vein and the same tradition. So Gramsci was an Italian Marxist intellectual in the early part of the 20th century, 1920s, 1930s. And of course, living in Italy, this was of course the period of Mussolini and fascism, and being a left-wing intellectual under Mussolini's regime, it's not surprising that Gramsci was arrested and was a political prisoner in those years. And Gramsci actually produced much of his work, much of his kind of really seminal work, while he was in prison. His best known work, I've got an abridged version here, is called Prison Notebooks. This is just kind of selections from prison notebooks. You can see this is quite a hefty volume in itself, so you can imagine the original was quite large. But again, Gramsci had a lot of time to write it because he didn't have much else to do in jail. Yeah, he produced a large volume of work in those years. And again, Gramsci's work is, very complex and convoluted, and we certainly don't have time to look at it in any depth. But the key kind of points for our purposes is that Gramsci kind of explained the reason for the persistence, the survival and the persistence of capitalism in terms of the kind of hegemonic culture that capitalism had created. So again, if we're kind of asking this question, well, why hasn't the revolution happened yet? And in the sort of early 20th century, I mean, it had already been several decades since Marx. Marxists were already asking, well, why hasn't the revolution happened yet? And of course, we talked about kind of Vladimir Lenin in imperialism. Lenin explained the survival of capitalism in terms of imperialism. That capitalism kind of expanded, and through colonialism. Basically, capitalism as the driver of colonialism had kind of expanded outwards and was exploiting people in other lands and kind of using the profits from that to kind of buy off the workers back home, thus kind of staving off the revolution. So that was kind of Lenin's explanation for the persistence, for the survival of capitalism. But Gramsci actually focused on the role of ideas and the role of hegemonic culture. So essentially, the idea of cultural hegemony, in other words, the idea that capitalism persists because people can't even imagine anything else. We kind of grow up in a world where we are kind of from pretty much from birth, we grow up in a capitalist society. We are kind of indoctrinated with capitalist values, with a capitalist way of thinking, to the extent that we can't even imagine anything else. Capitalism seems like the force of nature, like a system that cannot be challenged, to the point that we can't even imagine living any other way. So capitalism totally pervasive, and again kind of maintains this hold on our kind of way of thinking, again through lots of kind of media, so through the mass media, through the institutions of the state, through education, through art, through culture, through religion. All of it is kind of serving to reinforce the dominant set of ideas, which are the kind of capitalist hegemonic culture. And so Gramsci believed that so long as this was the case, and again kind of link that back to Marx and the idea of false consciousness, you can see the obvious links there. And Gramsci believed that the only way forward, the only way to bring about the revolution, was to develop a working class consciousness through Marxist intellectualism, through working class intellectualism. And Gramsci saw himself as, basically doing just that. He was a revolutionary, not in terms of kind of, going out and taking violent revolutionary action. Instead, he believed that the necessary, first step, key step towards revolution was to promote working class intellectualism, to develop what he called a counter-hegemony, an alternative view of the world, to kind of be able to challenge and deconstruct and take apart these ideas that underpin the capitalist system, and to educate the proletariat on the reality of their own exploitation, on the reality of the unequal power system and the extent to which they were being exploited. And only by doing that would class consciousness be developed, and would revolution then ultimately come. So whereas Marx kind of saw revolution, the development of class consciousness and revolution, as something that was inevitable, Gramsci said no, it's something that has to be cultivated through working class intellectualism, and he saw himself as kind of working towards that goal. So yeah, this idea of cultural hegemony, the hegemonic culture means that the ruling capitalist class are able to maintain control basically by controlling ideology, by controlling the way that people think. Yes, violence, coercion, physical violence is still kind of there as a backup, and the the coercive instruments, the police and the instruments of the state and all of that are there. If and the military, I mean, all of that is there to as a backup. But for the most part, hegemonic power is maintained not necessarily through the instruments of coercion, but through control of the way that people think, by propagating a particular set of values and norms which become so universally accepted that they're seen as common sense, the natural order of things, and they are not challenged. So yeah, the only solution, according to Gramsci, develop a working class consciousness, workers' education, challenge the hegemonic capitalist culture by building a counter-hegemony, and only by doing this, by building this class consciousness, can capitalism be successfully overthrown. So that leads us on to critical theory. So again, Gramsci was not a critical theorist as such, but similar ideas in critical theory. So again, critical theory kind of harks back to the Frankfurt School, people like Max Horkheimer and so on. But in terms of international relations, critical theory in IR, as an IR paradigm, was developed particularly by Robert Cox in kind of the late 1970s and the 1980s. So Robert Cox basically applied a similar way of thinking to the international system. So once again, the idea that the international system is fundamentally exploitative. So in this sense, I mean, Cox is again working in the Neo-Marxist tradition, and kind of is in broad agreement with such as the dependency school and so on, in the sense that there is a recognition that the capitalist global system is exploitative, that class struggle is the basis, the real driver of world politics, class struggle at the global level. And Robert Cox basically again kind of argued that this fundamentally inequality, this fundamentally unequal and exploitative capitalist system again is maintained and perpetuated through ideology, and through control of the way that the masses think, through a dominant set of values and beliefs and assumptions. So basically, we kind of take for granted the way that the system is, and we kind of come to see it as being natural and almost inevitable. And so Cox kind of sees conventional international relations theory as kind of not really challenging these deeply ingrained ideas. Cox talks about traditional international relations theory as what he calls problem-solving theory. By traditional international relations theory, I'm talking about realism and liberalism, or neo-realism and neoliberal institutionalism. So at the time when Cox was writing, the kind of big debate, the so-called third great debate in IR, was the then current debate between neo-realism and neoliberal institutionalism. Cox is basically saying that these theories don't really ask deep enough questions. They are problem-solving theories in that they take the current world system as they take it for granted. So, for example, the assumption that we're working with nation states, the assumption that we live in a world of nation states, the assumption of state sovereignty, the concept of law, and so on. The kind of underlying set of norms and values and beliefs that kind of underpin how diplomacy works and the international system works, and of course capitalism. There's not kind of not a challenge to the capitalist economic system, which kind of underpins world politics. So, according to Cox, these so-called problem-solving theories, they try to solve problems within this kind of pre-existing system which they take for granted. So, for example, questions of war and peace. So realists, for example, say that the fundamental thing that we need to do is secure national security. So we do that in the context of a world of nation states and conditions of anarchy, and the power struggle among states. Basically, we need to look to self-help, and we also need to look to alliance systems, and we need to build balances of power in order to ensure the security and survival of the nation state. Liberals say, actually, that's that approach is dangerous, because balances of power and alliance systems actually lead to intensified rivalries and ultimately to all-out war. The way forward, therefore, is collective security and to foster cooperation and promote the spread of democracy and promote the spread of cooperative trade relationships and build international institutions and all of that. But both paradigms are kind of working within the existing system. They are trying to solve certain problems, but not challenging the fundamentals of the system. Cox is saying that actually you need to go a lot deeper. You need to look at, you need to question the whole system itself, not just try to solve problems in the context of it. So what he calls critical theory is an approach which is critical of the fundamental building blocks, the set of ideas and values and beliefs and assumptions that underpin the existing system. So Cox's approach, again, Cox is working in the Neo-Marxist kind of tradition, and his theory is explicitly normative. What we mean by that is that Cox sees the purpose of theory to be to actually try to improve the world. So we're not just here to comment on the world, we are here to improve the world, and we improve the world through emancipation. So basically, the world, again, fundamentally exploitative, fundamentally based on patterns of domination and subordination, unequal power relationships between different groups of people, and again, all of this underpinned in a hegemonic system of ideas. So in order to bring about emancipation, we have to challenge this system of ideas, this unequal cultural system which enables and perpetuates inequality and exploitation. So again, kind of working in the same tradition as Gramsci, not necessarily based directly on Gramsci, but working in the same tradition as Gramsci. So again, ideas as power, and again, this kind of underpins critical theory, but also underpins the next few theoretical paradigms that we will be looking at in the next few videos as well. So critical theory, again, is kind of a specific paradigm in international relations. But more broadly, there are a set of paradigms which are kind of coming from a similar place. And all of these paradigms can be described as critical in one way or another, because each of them is trying to kind of, again, question and challenge the system of ideas and the dominant culture, which they see as kind of being the source of inequality and unequal power relationships and exploitation in the world. So all of this rooted in dominant systems of ideas, trying to kind of question those ideas, deconstruct those ideas, and ultimately bring about emancipation in one way or another through building an alternative way of seeing the world. So that's true of critical theory, but it's also true of constructivism. It is true of feminism in IR. It is true of the post-colonial approaches as well. So all of these theories, and we'll be looking at constructivism, feminism, post-colonialism in the next few videos. All of these approaches can be described as coming from kind of a similar methodology, and ultimately based on the perception of ideas as being the basis of power and unequal power relationships in the world. So that's just a brief introduction to critical theory in IR. Obviously, it's much more complex than that in reality, and obviously, I would encourage you to do a lot of reading, and particularly if you want to kind of really get to grips with critical theory in IR, then I would start with the work of Robert Cox. So yeah, I've kind of skimmed over that, quite quickly, but hopefully that's kind of given you at least an introduction to some of the main points. And again, we'll be returning to some of these ideas in the next few videos when we look at kind of other critical paradigms and international relations. So thanks very much for watching. Once again, apologies for no new content for a while, but over the next few weeks I will do my best to get some new videos up. I'd like to again kind of complete this series of kind of quite lengthy videos, and I know probably a lot of people will prefer stuff which is kind of more kind of summarized, short videos, and I do plan to create some of those a little bit later on, realism in 5 minutes, liberalism in 5 minutes, and whatever. But I think it's important first of all to kind of have a slightly more detailed explanation of these theories. So I'm going to complete that series of videos first of all, and then later on I'm going to look at some kind of short 5-10 minute videos which kind of summarizes stuff a little bit more concisely. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you all on the next video. Thanks very much.